Welcome. Good afternoon or good evening to depending or good morning in some cases, and welcome to the on behalf of the organizers. I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural installment in our seminar series, More Than Humanities: Interdisciplinary Collaborations, Multiagential Worlds, a co-venture between the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto, Canada, and the Centre for the Environmental Humanities at the University of Bristol, UK. My name is Kate Sandilands. I'm a professor in environmental studies in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, and I'll be moderating today's session. In Canada, at gatherings in Canada, we are accustomed to opening our sessions with a territorial acknowledgement, recognizing that that Canada is a settler colonial nation. It's sort of an interesting, right there, sort of an interesting cross-cultural moment. But with your forgiveness, I'm going to continue that tradition. Although we are currently in a variety of different places, I am currently coming to you from, and EUC is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples, including the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit. Toronto is now home to many different Indigenous peoples, including Inuit and Métis peoples, as well as First Nations. We are also privileged to be included in the Dish with One Spoon, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and which recognizes the peaceful coexistence of multiple nations and the need to take care of and use resources wisely in the shared territory that we are all privileged to be able to call home. The More Than Humanities seminar series is designed to showcase the growing body of dynamic scholarship in the environmental humanities, focusing on the world as a more than human assemblage of agencies and considering diverse forms of life and non-life, animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, viruses, minerals, soils, water, and matter more generally, as collectively shaping past, present, and future social and ecological relations. Drawing on methodologically innovative and interdisciplinary practices, especially including arts-based research, this series highlights the synergies between the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change and the Centre for the Environmental Humanities to demonstrate the exciting work currently underway at both institutions in more than human environmental humanities research and to create ongoing collaborative relations between us. Today's panel on More Than Human Sensory Worlds explores the shared worlds of human and non-human animals. How might we learn to experience the world otherwise by attending to goshawk seeing? What happens when rabbits and people share interactive affective space together? How do the senses of dark-dwelling animals change understandings of what it means to live without sight? Understanding multisensory animal worlds both deepens our understanding of human-animal relations and reframes the nature of human perception. I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers today, David Anderson, Andy Flack, and Melvin Chan. David Anderson is a PhD candidate in environmental studies in EUC at York University and an award-winning sessional lecturer in sexual diversity studies at the University of Toronto. Through the close reading analytics of blindness as teacher and blindness as student, his dissertation examines entanglements of literacy with the human and more than human kinships, and blindness and violence across the works of a diverse set of blind and visually impaired authors. Melvin Chan is also a PhD candidate in environmental studies at EUC at York. His research expertise is in human-animal studies, animal-focused environmental education, coloniality, and affect theory. His current research explores the social organization of rabbit welfare and advocacy in British Columbia, Canada. Andy Flack is Associate Professor of Environmental and Sensory History at the University of Bristol. His research is primarily focused on the ways in which people have related to non-human animals across the 19th and 20th centuries. His current research program focuses on how those relationships have taken shape across the Earth's various dark environments. David, Melvin, and Andy, I realize I just got the order of the bios wrong, will each speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions and conversation. We ask that you hold your questions until the Q&A session after all three speakers have had their turn, at which point you're welcome either to raise your electronic hand or type your question in the Q&A. Sam Labutt, one of our intrepid RAs, currently in Bristol, will be watching for your electronic hands, and I will be monitoring the Q&A. With that, I turn things over to David.
Thank you very much, Kate. So everyone knows I'm legally blind, and I'm just going to be reading instead of doing PowerPoint. But yeah, that's why I'm looking at my big screen here, just FYI. Good morning, as Kate said, and afternoon and evening to everyone. Thank you to Kate and Andy for organizing and inviting me, and to all of you for coming. I wish to also express my gratitude to the people and lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit, where I began this research, and the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and their unceded territories of the West Coast, to which I have now returned here in Vancouver. This presentation comes from Rearranging the Senses, a central chapter of my dissertation, in which I conduct close readings of two books that centralize human and more than human kinships. One between a blind man and a dog guide, and the other between a sighted falconer and a goshawk. Building on environmental humanities and disability studies scholarship, or eco-crip theory, I orient my readings toward a critique of anthropo-ocular centricism. That is, the taken for granted dominance and exceptionality of human vision over other human and more than human senses, and of humanity over more than human lives and nature writ large. In other words, anthropo-ocular centrism refers to the presumed mastery of the human eye and its shoring up of human exceptionalism. This critique takes up two parallel sensorial pedagogical analytics: blindness as teacher, for example, what does blindness teach us about nature, and blindness as student, that is, what does nature teach us about blindness, for example. Thus, my reading privileges the non-dominant insights of blindness as a valid and vital sensorium, just as much as I privilege the non-dominant and non-human insights of more than human sensoriums. By attending to the significant rearrangements both authors experience, similar rearrangements of loss and of the senses, and their respective and particular rearrangements of blindness and becoming human, my chapter reveals important lessons in sensorial and often ocular humility, interspecies vulnerability, multi-species kinships, and the need for what Julieta Singh terms, quote, vulnerable listening, as a means toward survivable forms of what she calls, quote, unmastery. Sorry, one moment. I just got to turn on my, there we go. The two books I examine include Rod McCalco's The Two in One, Walking with Smokey, Walking with Blindness, and Helen MacDonald's H is for Hawk. While largely aligning with the themes and motifs of eco-recovery narratives, these texts importantly resist common tropes of the genre, such as a linear narrative of healing, or otherwise concluding with a total recovery from the original illness or injury which occasioned the story, which I'm happy to discuss later in the Q&A. While I focus on MacDonald's book today, it is worth noting how McCalco's text enables my inclusion of H is for Hawk in my dissertation's pantheon, if you will, of blind authors. McCalco argues two key points. First, that we generally, quote, feel and think of and experience blindness, quote, in an exclusively human way, even though, quote, nature gives or revokes vision without regard for our individual interests, purposes, hopes, and fears. That is, the various moral attributes that we give to blindness, gift or curse, kismet, or divine retribution, are human contrivances. Nature does not care about nor authorize these conceptions. And second, that we must be critical of these common sense understandings of blindness. In combination, McCalco's arguments invite us to think far more capaciously about blindness. Unique among other disabilities and similar to sight and vision, blindness deeply shapes, Western at least, languages, philosophies, politics, and epistemologies. At the same time, no two embodied forms of blindness are alike. Indeed, McCalco argues that we must conceive of multiple quote unquote blindnesses in order that we learn how to live in blindness rather than simply to live with it. To this, I would add, we must also learn to live in rather than simply with or in mastery over nature. Thus, McCalco's thinking bolsters my argument that through their intimate relationship with Mabel the goshawk and their attendant rearrangements of loss, the senses, and experiences of becoming like a hawk and then becoming human once more, MacDonald encounters profound moments of more than metaphorical blindness that offer important lessons in vulnerability, humility, and unmastery. Overall, my reading argues for a much needed rearrangement of our ocular-centric and humanist, if not outright anthropocentric, political sensoriums, a la Jacques Rancière's distribution of the sensible, and following Julieta Singh, that we aim such a politics toward, quote, voices that have always been there, but that we have been untrained to hear, so that, quote, we might begin to hear other songs of survival and to sound differently among them. Winner and nominee of several awards, H is for Hawk tracks the year after their father's unexpected death in 2007, in which MacDonald experienced a bout of profound depression. During this time, they are drawn to train a young goshawk named Mabel, uh, a species of hawk notorious as the most difficult of all the species to train. Throughout the book, MacDonald provides numerous observations concerning ways of seeing and failing to see, as well as modes of being seen and unseen related to falconry, human and hawk senses, the environment, etc., to name but a few. Through the process of grieving their father's death and training a goshawk for the first time, MacDonald also shares with us necessary lessons about our relationships to other species and to the environment, and perhaps most importantly, how to persist in and survive our own messy, heartbreaking, and all too human lives as humans. In this work, I examine MacDonald's rearrangements of loss in their senses, but most notably the ways in which they become more or less like a hawk. Years later, after publishing the book and after Mabel's passing, MacDonald was able to write that, quote, animals don't exist in order to teach us things, but, quote, that is what they have always done, and most of what they teach us is what we think we know about ourselves. The ultimate rearrangement MacDonald experiences, however, is a rearrangement of their sense of being human or becoming human again, but it begins with loss. Upon their father's death, robbing MacDonald, as they put it, of an entire world, several rearrangements emerge. An increased sense of isolation in their pain, a related and dangerous proximity to lunacy, and the, quote, inevitable decision that they will bring a goshawk into their life. Reflecting on the responses to their father's death, MacDonald observes that such loss, quote, happens to everyone, but you feel it alone. Shocking loss isn't to be shared, no matter how hard you try. In addition, they acknowledge from the very outset that their experience of being alone in their loss borders, or even, quote, might carry the tang of lunacy. For MacDonald, their father's loss represents a world that is not only gone, but one that no longer makes sense. After picking up their father's belongings from the hospital with their mother, MacDonald smiles as they look over the Thames, quote, because the water was sliding down to the sea, and this simple physics still made sense, the rest of the world didn't. While the simple physics of the water offers a brief respite, the unremitting regularity of transportation, commerce, sociality, and labor carrying on around them prompts MacDonald to remark that, quote, none of these things made any sense at all. Amid their encroaching madness and lunacy, MacDonald avers that, quote, I'd never thought I'd train a goshawk. Ever. I'd never seen anything of myself reflected in their solitudinous, murderous eyes. Not for me, I'd thought many times, nothing like me. But, they reflect, the world had changed, and so had I. This change reflects their internal rearrangement of loss as much as it can be attributed to their changing world around them. A world of floods, the heat wave that followed that summer, and their relationship to a well-loved yet broken land they discuss early on in the start of the book. Worlds lost, wild, and broken inside and out. Further, well before Mabel's arrival and the more profound and embodied sensorial rearrangements the goshawk contributes to, MacDonald repeatedly underlines how goshawk signal struggles with vision. Wild goshawks are notoriously difficult to spot, and even trained hawks effortlessly erase humans from their own sight without warning. And MacDonald themselves sees nothing of themselves in their murderous eyes. Small, MacDonald states about their selection of a goshawk, quote, was the only decision I made. I didn't think for a second there was any choice in the matter of the hawk itself. The hawk had caught me. MacDonald is also seized by another force, T.H. White, the British author who details his attempt and woeful and abusive failure to train his own goshawk, Goss, in his book, The Goshawk. Akin to struggles with vision concerning seeing and being seen by goshawks, this particular capture's initial appearance evokes something similar to visual impairment. MacDonald's, quote, eyes started avoiding a book that lived on the shelf by my desk. At first, it was just a visual blind spot, a tick of a blink, then something like a grain of sleep in the corner of my eye. Soon, however, MacDonald, quote, couldn't sit at my desk without knowing it was there. Second shelf down, red cloth cover, silver lettered spine, The Goshawk by T.H. White. Soon it got to the point that the bloody book was all I could see when I sat at my desk, even if it was the one thing in the room I wouldn't look at. MacDonald is thus pulled toward the goshawk in a kind of tug-of-war with vision, blindness, and invisibility. Their eyes, seemingly independent of their will, avoid the book, transforming it into this blind spot, this tick, this grain of sleep, and it is all they can see, even when trying not to look at it. The theme of struggling with vision resounds again loudly here, further aligning with a kind of blindness or visual impairment. The visual, of course, is the most powerful of Hawk's senses. Yet here in their home at their own desk, MacDonald's eyes begin to play tricks with them concerning a book specifically about hawks, particularly about goshawks, and precisely about this desire to train one for all the wrong reasons. Parallel, if not as severe to White, MacDonald recounts numerous moments of regret and reflection concerning the missteps they make while training Mabel. Once Mabel arrives, MacDonald describes first, however, how falconry works in order to build sufficient trust and understanding between themselves and Mabel. Through these lessons, we become aware of three important things. First, to create effective relationship with Mabel, MacDonald must learn to become invisible, to quote, not be there, so that Mabel can become accustomed to them. Through this disappearing trick and the uses of falconry hoods and other tactics, MacDonald underlines how important the management of Mabel's sight is for their successful cooperation. Second, as MacDonald incrementally introduces Mabel to the world outside their apartment, so to as acclimatize the young hawk to humans and our often loud and boisterous world, the more Mabel becomes accustomed to it, the more MacDonald is horrified and seeks to flee from it. These first two lessons compose the first part of MacDonald's and Mabel's sensorial rearrangements. In falconry, Mabel's impressive visual sensorium must be carefully considered and responded to in order to ensure that when the time comes, Mabel will be willing and understand how to return to Mabel's fist. And finally, last of the 3 points, the more time MacDonald spends with Mabel, the less they wish to spend with other humans. Related to Mabel's inevitable arrival, which I mentioned earlier, MacDonald admits that from the first moment the two met, quote, without knowing why, I'd chosen to be the hawk. Eventually, MacDonald describes how they, quote, stayed out longer with Mabel, found it harder and harder to return because out with the hawk, I didn't need a home. Out there, I forgot I was human at all. Everything the hawk saw was raw and real and drawn hair fine, and everything else was dampened to nothing. In another instance, when their mother calls, MacDonald is inundated with what is capturing Mabel's attention. Quote, field fence, field fare, wing, flick, pheasant feather, on path, sun on wire, 12 wood pigeons, half a mile distance, tick, 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 all in italics and hyphenated. Amid this human becoming hawked in, quote, I couldn't hear what my mother was saying because there were 12 wood pigeons half a mile away, and the hawk was looking at them, and so was I. I could not hear my mother's pain. I could not feel my own. On another occasion, MacDonald writes how my attention was microscopically fierce. I become a thing of eyes and will alone. Uh, uh, Later, when they're giving chase, when Mabel goes after some animals, they become visually impaired once more. MacDonald stumbling through the brush, quote, blindly, then, quote, smashing through branches of a fallen tree, blind and brute, until they find Mabel again. Eventually, MacDonald loses their sense of themselves as a human almost entirely until they realize that they have, as much as they are able, become a hawk. This realization, of course, comes to a head after Mabel lashes out at MacDonald twice. For instance, in one case, when Mabel is hungry, but MacDonald is too wrought with their own depression and pain to realize what's happened. And MacDonald realizes with horror that Quote, I'd turned myself into a hawk. I was nervous, highly strung, paranoid, prone to fits of terror and rage. I fled from society, hid from everything, found myself drifting into strange states where I wasn't certain who or what I was. Through hunting with Mabel, MacDonald writes that I had assumed her alien perspective, her inhuman understanding of the world. It brought something akin to madness, and I did not understand what I had done. Reflecting on their passion for goshawks and birds, well, hawks and birds of prey as a child, MacDonald writes, when I was small, I thought turning into a hawk would be a magical thing, but now the lesson was killing me. It was not at all the same. Here, loss and madness and intimate proximity with Mabel all collide into a sort of theriomorphism. MacDonald comes to embody the human described traits of goshawks, to assume their alien perspective, their inhuman understanding of the world, leading to madness. But they also take up the actual accipidocentric ways in which Mabel perceives the world. They flinch at what Mabel flinches at. They look at birds and rodents as prey. MacDonald's childhood dreams of turning into a hawk become a nightmare. Unfortunately, MacDonald doesn't learn their lessons soon enough, and Mabel attacks them once more on another day out flying. Dazed and dripping with blood, MacDonald admits that, quote, I kept on hawking, stumbling across the fields in a haze of pained euphoria. However, after coming to terms with what they have done, MacDonald eventually reflects with deep humility about the lessons they have learned. Quote, I know that some of my friends see my keeping a hawk as more morally suspect. Oh, sorry, sorry, but that having a hawk in their life is the only way that they can understand how complicated and full of wonder they are. Of all the lessons that MacDonald learns, the greatest of these is that you feel more human once you have known, even in your imagination, what it's like to not be. And reflecting too that MacDonald has learned the danger that comes in mistaking the wildness we give a thing for the wildness that animates it. Overall, MacDonald offers a compelling case concerning the problem of the recovery memoir, resisting its usual moralizing and linear progression toward overcoming the hurt or harm which precipitated its emergence. Through humility rather than mastery over, and deep reflection on the inevitable lessons that humans derive from more than human beings, we are given a way to feel, think, experience, and come to understand blindness in sight, nature and wildness, and our more than human kin otherwise. Apologies for going over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'll turn it over to Andy now.
Great. Just give me a second to sort the screen out. So,
While Andy is doing that, I encourage those of you who see that their name is Don Reyes to actually switch to their actual name so that we can call on you in the Q&A.
okay. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay. Perfect. Right. Just give me a second. Not sure the screen is switching to me though. Is it?
See you.
Up here?
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm not the main person. Does it matter?
As in, like, I can see your face if you're looking this way.
Here. Oh yes. Okay. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. This is
Do you
confusing.
need a PowerPoint thing?
No, no, I'm all good. Thank you. Okay. Right. Give me a second. Okay, right. So I also don't have any slides, and that's mainly because I'm going to be talking around kind of getting to grips with animals who we imagine have no vision, or rather kind of address the world or interact with the world in more than visual ways. So it kind of felt possibly a strange thing to have kind of slides and to lean into that visuality of things. So all animals sense their wider environments in ways that allow them to come to know and interact with the worlds in which they must survive. The nature of these physical sensory responses is critical to the building of relationships both within and between species and between creatures and their wider worlds. The character of such responses reveals much about what the world means in a material sense to those who dwell within it. Of course, the world is always co-authored. The sensory systems of humans and other animals overlie and intersect in critical ways. And yet, even when thinking about the sensory ecology of other animals, their sensory systems, and how these systems affect their perception of and responses to the world, humans often concentrate on the classical senses that culturally and historically make sense to us: vision, smell, audition, touch, and taste. But significantly new research in the field of sensory ecology reveals an extraordinary array of sensory abilities relating to bodily movement, to vibration, chemical response, electric and magnetic field detection, and many more. And these more than human sensory capacities allow animals to function effectively in the world, to compete for resources or mate, to find food, or escape becoming food for someone else. So I can provide a couple of illustrative examples of this. We have desert ants in hostile salt pans in Tunisia, and they build cognitive maps based on smell, deploying their antennae in stereo to process sensory data to achieve this olfactory cartography. Elephants, meanwhile, use low-frequency sounds or infrasounds as a form of long-distance but private communication, allowing herds to maintain contact and convey important information about their world over tens of kilometers. So it is not just a matter of some creatures possessing better senses than others, but about the existence of inherently diverse ways of experiencing the world. These are ways of sensing, ways of perceiving and being that often extend far beyond our own. That this is now so clearly the case makes it rather surprising that animal historians in particular have not done a huge amount to think about multi-species pasts in the context of sensory entanglements. There are those who are doing it, but it's quite a minority of people. In this short paper, I want to explore how naturalists and life scientists more broadly have tried to know some of those sensory worlds. In particular, I'm going to explore dark-dwelling animals, those creatures that live their lives in low-light conditions. Now, darkness offers us an environmental context in which we generally are not very well adapted, either to navigation or to the precision vision on which we often rely. But the animals there, conversely, frequently do possess sensory adaptations which allow them to navigate, to predate, to survive and thrive in those low light conditions. And I could draw many examples: the super olfaction of the hedgehog, the tactile organs of deep sea organisms living in what to us appears to be total darkness, the giant eyes of the owl. But I want, however, to focus in on one of the most enigmatic of dark-dwelling creatures here, and that's the bat. There's a caveat here. When I speak of bats, I'm not speaking of all bats. There are well over 1,000 separate species of bat in the world. I'm talking of those that are insectivorous, those that we now know echolocate, so use sound in order to precisely navigate and predate in their dark environments. But the figure of the chaotically spiraling bat on the wing has long troubled popular and scientific imaginations. As the Harvard physicist Robert Galambos noted towards the 20th century's midpoint, quote, "The bat flies at night, and this fact has appealed both to mystics who saw in its nocturnal wanderings collusions with powers of evil, and to naturalists who speculated on how the animal directs itself under conditions where the eyes can be of little to no use." The precise position of the winged beasts in relation to birds and quadrupeds remained a vexed question until well into the 19th century. Both the influential naturalists George Buffon and Oliver Goldsmith, for instance, thought that the animals were somewhere in between bird and beast. Now, while their status as mammalian was quickly thereafter confirmed, the question of their apparently extraordinary sensory abilities remained a puzzle for much longer. They seemed to fly erratically in an imperfect, even chaotic manner, and yet at the same time the creatures were undeniably able to effectively navigate and hunt for prey in low light conditions. But until the end of the 1980s, the way in which that could be done, those sensory mechanisms behind navigation and hunting strategy, proved a tricky mystery for naturalists to crack, and that produced all kind of doubts about their supposed sixth sense. A major part of the reason for naturalists' puzzlement lay in the simple fact that it was challenging to study those creatures at all in the dark. It was not, naturalists were not able to use the senses on which they usually relied to try and understand the creatures they wanted to observe. And indeed, the English naturalist Thomas Bell wrote in 1837 that bats were nocturnal and timid, making it difficult to either observe or secure a specimen for testing. The naturalist Edward Jesse noted around the same time that there was, quote, a silence and a rapidity which prevents me watching its motions in the dark, even with the aid of lantern light. Crucially, too, naturalists had to grapple with the notion that, as Italian polymath Lazzaro Spallanzani put it at the close of the 18th century, darkness for people is not the same as darkness for the bat. To understand how bats navigate in the dark, a very significant conceptual leap was required. And this fundamental set of challenges meant that naturalists' ability to move closer to an understanding of bat behavior in the field was severely constrained, both physically and conceptually. And this meant that for many, the controlled laboratory became a crucial experimental site. Late 18th century laboratory experiments tried to compensate for human visual limitations in the darkness itself by constructing other means of testing bat specimens. At the time, it was thought that bat navigational senses were probably focused or founded on an extra-sensitive touch membrane in their wings. Lazzaro Spallanzani was not so sure, and to try to find out how his specimens, and he had hundreds of them, sensed and experienced the worlds through which they moved, he constructed a bat maze. The bat maze was comprised of multiple obstacles. His maze was a controlled version of a bat's natural nocturnal world, and was a small room with 2 rows of threads hanging from the ceiling. Bells and strips of leaf material were attached to the ends of those threads to simulate the presence of prey in the night. Releasing his bats into this artificial nighttime, he listened for the metallic sounds of threads that were disturbed as bats passed them by. He really wanted to see what was going on in the darkness, so he lit a small candle in one corner of the room to provide a narrow glimpse into his shrouded artificial world. But this was not a good move, because he noticed that the bats mostly avoided the threads, but that they occasionally disturbed them with their wings as they touched them as they passed when there was light in the room. So the light itself disturbed the ways in which the bats were precisely moving through the space. So what would happen, he wondered, if he extinguished his candle's flame? And he found that when he did so, he could hear that bats' navigation became very precise. There were no sounds from the metallic threads from the ceiling. He knew this because he did not perceive those sounds. So he was using his hearing to try and observe what was going on. He worked out then that in total darkness, some specific sense kicked in. When the darkness was deep, that allowed the bats to precisely navigate. So they were not relying on vision in the way they did when the room was slightly lit. Something else was happening when the darkness was full. So he repeated his tests again and again, the stable conditions of his laboratory allowing him the time and the space to probe the creature's sensory secrets. Soon he resorted to violence so that he could investigate the specimen's different sensory capacities in turn. He poked hot wire through the eyes of some, gouged out the eyes of others, cutting away at the connective tissue and severing the optic nerve connecting the eyeball to the brain. In other experiments, he burned away at the insides of their ears to try and ensure that they could not perceive sounds through that mechanism. He then covered the eye wounds with leather to block light from the raw holes that he had created, in case the optic nerve somehow continued to receive light signals from the room. But the bats continued to fly perfectly through his bat maze, even without that sight. In the process, he learned that his bat's navigation in the dark was not dependent on vision, but was instead reliant on some kind of sound perception. And his brutal experimental setup was essentially repeated at the same time, but independently, by the Swiss physician, surgeon, and naturalist Louis Girine, who was working on the same problem at the same time independently in Paris. He too built a bat maze that allowed him to try to explore bat sensory behaviors. Now, these experiments, which intensively probed the relationship between touch, sight, sound, and darkness, meant that both Spallanzani and Girine were at least able to hypothesize that their bats must navigate via some special unknown auditory sense. And this was astounding. Spallanzani wrote of his absolute astonishment at this bat, which absolutely could see, even though deprived of its eyes. The laboratory setting then had proved crucial because it had permitted a range of engagements between the life scientist and the dark-adapted animal that simply were not possible in the field. And this had allowed Spallanzani and Girine to take a small step towards a better understanding of their bat's sensory abilities. But over the course of the following century and a half, naturalists largely forgot the findings of Spallanzani and Girine. Instead, they relied on their own vision, or they fell back on their own vision as a means of knowing bat senses. In their laboratories, they slaughtered and disassembled countless bat bodies, and they looked upon through their microscopes the apparent organs of their extraordinary sensation, such as the creature's elaborate nose sleeves or their wing membranes. And many concluded the secret to bat navigation must lie in the sensitivity of that wing membrane. It was not until around 1940 that ultrasonic recording devices, deployed by physicists at Harvard University, picked up the ultrasonic signals that bats emitted and identified the structures in the throat that were necessary for bats to emit those sounds. What became clear was that bats inhabit a world that is substantially constructed through sound, and they possess the organs to produce and receive those sounds. In some contexts, too, they do use their eyes. Sometimes they do not. It's a complicated relationship between the senses when a bat is navigating and predating. But we remain, as people, as scientists, predominantly visual beings, and people have continued to utilize visual metaphors to try to understand the realities of this kind of world. Bats map the world through echoes, the visual metaphor of the map continuing to root scientific understanding of a bat's sensory life in our own terms. This reflects that presence of a fundamental conceptual gulf that separates humans and bats as living and perceiving beings. Such a gulf continues to shape scientific practice today. Donald Griffin, one of the men who identified echolocation in bats back around 1940, referred in 2010 to the enduring secrets of the bat sensorium as a magic well, an apparently endless body of enigmas and conundrums that limit our ability to know what it is like to be a bat. Those are the fundamental problems here. It's the physicality of going into the world to understand the senses of dark-dwelling creatures, combined with the conceptual difficulty of knowing a sensory world that is not our own. That's what we find nicely illustrated when we look at something like a bat, but I think also many other types of dark-dwelling creatures too. We are. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. Melvin.
Ooh, hang on.
All right. I do have some slides. Hopefully that shows up for everyone. And yeah, thanks for coming, for listening. It's great to listen to David and Andy speak as well, about different senses. I do have to apologize. I'm feeling a little bit sick, or have been sick for the past few days, so I sound a little bit different than how I normally would sound. But yeah, nonetheless, excited to talk about rabbits with you all today. Um, so as Kate mentioned, my name is Melvin. I'm an interdisciplinary social researcher in environmental studies, so in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. I'm coming to you today from the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as the current treaty holders. However, I do hail from, and my dissertation research, which I'll be sharing today, takes place on the shared unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Kwantlen, Tsawwassen, Semiahmoo, Katzie, Coquitlam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, which is what we often call Metro Vancouver, British Columbia. So I'll be talking through some of my data and analysis with you all today on affective experiences with rabbits. So this presentation is a bit maybe preliminary, but hopefully it's still kind of provocative and interesting. So I'm specifically, I guess, today asking, the question, what happens when rabbits and humans share spaces together? It's not actually so straightforward to answer, I think. But let's give it a try, and I'll share some, of the complexity of what I see in or sort of even what I feel like with this question. And just to sort of guide our or like my talk today, I'm specifically going to talk about European rabbits, which I'll show you in a couple slides. But to say that, these rabbits dig burrows and they collect them in a system called a warren. So I'm sort of using this warrening practice to guide or structure my talk. So we'll start at the surface. We'll talk a little bit, as an entry point into the talk about rabbits, how they figure into mostly Canadian society. We'll read a little bit deeper, maybe into one of the burrows, into the warrens, as I share examples of affective rabbit-human interactions from my data. And as we look toward, an exit to the warren, we'll end with some provocations for how we might sense and experience with rabbits. So what are rabbits? Well, rabbits, specifically, I'm referring to the European rabbit, which comes from the Iberian Peninsula, so like in southern Spain, and even more specifically, the domesticated variety. So you can see, let's see, does the pointer show up if I do this? So hopefully it shows up, but like there's a wild rabbit up top, and then this is the domesticated sort of variety on the bottom. So these rabbits are known as lagomorphs, otherwise called hair-shaped, and they've been introduced to like every continent except Antarctica. They're generally social colony animals. And they're usually friendly with humans. It's one of the main reasons the Romans domesticated them years and years ago. In British Columbia specifically, there are wild rabbits. There's also hares, but we won't talk about those today. So there's Nuttall's and Eastern cottontails. And there's many domestic uses, so for the European rabbit as well. So there are no wild European rabbits in British Columbia. There's only domesticated ones, even though these are all kind of rabbits. And European rabbits, the domesticated variety, are often used for hunting, so sort of in meat. We also farm them for meat and for their fur, for their pelts. They're used in companionship, so as pets. We'll also use them in sport, so often it's with like bunny, like race, like agility. If you're familiar with dog agility, people also do that with rabbits. And we do experiment on these animals as well. And abandoned ones are eventually classified as feral, but they're not really wild or wildlife, although British Columbia does something very interesting and does call them wildlife. And in the particular context that I'm interested that I work in, a number of laws and practices govern rabbits and our relationships with them. So in British Columbia, that's like there's a number of different acts and federally as well. So that apply to all of these, all rabbits. Pet and lab animals are governed by a different act, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Farmed animals are subjected to different regulations. Feral animals are managed through the Wildlife Act. And there's also municipal bylaws, so from various cities, other jurisdictions that also regulate rabbits. And so maybe with this background in mind, also, well, like we could turn to this question of what happens when rabbits and humans share spaces together. And hopefully I can sort of illustrate through my data why all these different acts and these different things are relevant. Um, but as I sort of suggest, they structure sort of how we can interact with animals and how we sense with them and how they can sense with us. So sort of the first example I wanted to share is one of a pet rabbit, and you can see this rabbit right here in the little pen. And these two quotes come from an animal shelter worker I interviewed at this specific facility. So this is a rabbit that has syphilis. And actually is from a litter, I believe, of 5 or 6 rabbits that all had syphilis. And they had them as babies. They're brought into the shelter, and now they're sort of there. When I took this picture and when I visited last fall, I believe they're about 3 or 4 years old. So it's been quite a while that the shelter has been caring for these rabbits. And this participant had told me that they don't want the shelter to have to make a hard decision when it comes to these rabbits because it's really hard. And I'll sort of quote from the slide because we love these animals and we want to see the best for them, but we're not a sanctuary, right? So animal shelters function to move animals out into the community, take them in, and they move them out and place them in homes. So, as this participant says, we have to be realistic about what's happening in their future and their welfare too. And as much as we're giving them the best life as we can, are we really, just doing that when they're just sitting there and they're getting fed and cleaned? This participant expressed a lot of concern because they were fostering one of these rabbits with syphilis. And they were wrestling with whether or not the shelter would have to euthanize them because who's going to take this rabbit? When this person had told me that when they put these rabbits up for adoption and they talk about them, they're not putting in that these rabbits have syphilis. Yet people will react often negatively when told that they do have syphilis, and there's certain restrictions and certain precautions that we have to take. These rabbits can't be housed with other animals or other rabbits. They're also quite shy. And so there's this sort of hard decision, quote unquote, that might be looming that the shelter might have to make. And what, is hard, I guess, about it. And what sort of affective power is being conveyed when things are hard. Another example comes from feral rabbits. So feral rabbits in British Columbia are often abandoned rabbits. And these are pet rabbits that people take and dump somewhere because they can no longer care for them. In British Columbia, they're labeled as wildlife, although there's been changes to the law that allow you to now trap and hunt them and kill them without any permitting or license required. You could literally go to Jericho Beach, which I'll show you a picture of, and there's a bunch of rabbits everywhere. You could shoot them, and that's totally legal. Before you needed a permit to sort of move them. And so these are all rabbits. If you're looking at the picture, there's a ton of rabbits here, probably around 9 or 8 black rabbits in an enclosure that's about 10 feet by 20 feet. There's hay on the bottom, and there's wooden houses for them to hide in. And these are all feral, and they've been housed together in this colony. And the reason is, and I'll quote from this animal shelter participant, is that a lot of people believe that no domestic animals should be free roaming. And if it's a dog or a cat or anything, it should not be free roaming. So in terms of that, a domestic animal might be off a property and is sort of at large. That's what animal shelters and these organizations have to wrestle with. How do we care for these for these animals? There's a distinction between domestic and sort of wild that we're making. and that is also again imbued with sort of affect. So to show you maybe another picture of rabbits, and I'll sort of highlight them. They're all black. But my participants have told me that, these rabbits can't survive in the wild, but they have. And there isn't an easy answer because these rabbits are invasive. So they have to be controlled, like by the government. Yet the government says that they're domesticated and therefore they're not their responsibility. So it's hard to really know sort of what happens with them. Yet we also attach many different kinds of affects to them. In some cases, they're really beloved, and it's hard to make a decision if you have to euthanize them. And in other cases, they're pests and seen quite negatively. Um, I'll give you just the last, example that pet rabbits have been becoming quite popular in a cafe sort of style. If you're familiar with animal cafes, you can go and pet a bunch of animals for some nominal fee, and you can also, adopt them if you're interested. And so at this cafe in Vancouver, there are all these different rabbits, and in these different pictures, there are rabbits housed in pens and on a big floor. There are some rabbits with a snuffle mat. And these rabbits, as I learned from one of my participants, actually used to be housed in a larger colony. So instead of having, maybe two or three of them in each pen, all 20 of them used to be in the room together. They would get into fights sometimes, as they do. Um, and potential visitors, adopters did not like that they got in fights. So people, as my participant told me, um, I did not like seeing rabbits with blood on them or with their ears sort of chewed on or ripped as they got into fights. So this is a very normal thing for rabbits. But in response to this reaction, in response to this affect, um, this participant who helped run the cafe had changed the housing style to these pens now. So sort of, kind of questions that come up are like, how do we see rabbits? How do we interact with rabbits, hear them, touch them? But also, how do they sort of experience us? How do they see us, hear us, touch us, smell us? Um, it's they're doing something that's very normal for them. Yet we react in a different way when we see them fight, for example, in their colony. And so this leads me to sort of wonder or have muse a little bit on how we mold rabbits to fit quite a number of roles, whether it's meat, fur, companion, feral, sometimes wild. And in this way, they're a bit plastic. So if you're familiar with the concept of neuroplasticity, and how our brain connections sort of can move and change. Um, Rabbits and maybe species can like sort of does this as well, or we can do this as well. And it reminds me again of some work by Zakiya Iman Jackson in her book Becoming Human, where she discusses the plasticization of blackness. So this sort of refiguring or figuring of blackness at the ontological level. So she writes that plasticity is a mode of transmogrification where the fleshy being of blackness is experimented with as if it were infinitely malleable, lexical, and biological matter, such that blackness is produced as sub-superhuman at once, a form where form shall not hold, potentially everything and nothing at the register of ontology. And so this plasticity of blackness shapes how black or blackened affects are felt and responded to. And I wonder, similarly, how might this plasticity of rabbits or of species, which has always been entangled with questions of blackness and humanism, might push, pull, or tug on the affects in our interactions with rabbits and their interactions with us. So it's quite complex how we interact with rabbits, how we sense with rabbits, how they sense with us. Um, and it is also structured through these different regulations and practices that we have sort of put in place. So there's a lot of different layers, I think, to sensing and experiencing with rabbits. You might be, if you're a reader of Donna Haraway, you might recall she asked, whom and what do I touch when I touch my dog? And that was in When Species Meet. So, maybe we can wonder, whom and what do I touch when I touch a rabbit? And what about when a rabbit touches us or sort of is with us? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Melvin. Wow, those were three wonderful presentations. Thank you so much again to David and to Andy and to Melvin. I wonder if I could start out the Q&A by asking if Andy, Melvin, David, you have any questions for each other. I certainly have some questions and saw some through lines through the three talks, but I wonder if you have any burning questions for each other that you'd like to start out with. Okay, I will leave it to Sam to monitor. Oh, David,
Sorry,
thank you.
I just was reviewing my notes to see where I'd put them. Sorry, I forgot my. Is it okay? Would
Yes,
now
please.
work? Okay. Well, I have one for each of you actually, and like Kate said, great presentations. Really lovely to be presenting with the two of you. For Andy, it was about the experiments, and I know it's not quite the same, but I really enjoyed hearing about the overview of natural history, about the ways of getting at how do like the basically I would call it an ocular centrism approach to learning about bat sensoriums and how kind of have to get out of our own way to learn more. I was really enjoying and also horrified by some of your examples. And the one about the peering through with the candle and then not, or the lantern, and the difference in terms of that experiment. I was wondering if you had more you would like to share about that. But I was also curious if you knew anything about, and no worries if you don't, I can't remember his name, but there was a natural philosopher around the same time who was blind, who studied bees, who partitioned the hive with glass panels and would take this peek and get his assistant to describe it to him and then close it back up to try to get, into the secret lives of bees. But it just reminded me of that, of these ways of peeking in. And I was wondering if there was any, I know it's not in the dark, but in the hive is dark, I would imagine in some ways. Just curious about more about the experiments and if you could talk more about that way of what are ways that humans can get out of their, like how we can get to a different kind of metaphors or different approaches to different sensoriums when we are engaging with creatures that have sensoriums so different from ours. Um, and for Melvin, I was really captured by the idea of plasticity, as you said from the start, this idea about who determines the domesticity or the wildness or the ferality of a creature, and this idea of the all the different things that rabbits represent. And I was wondering, aside from those sort of taxonomies, does your work also explore like the symbology or metaphors of rabbits? Like I was thinking about the syphilis, that idea of like multiplying like rabbits, to put it politely. But just curious about the ways in which those other strands of like culture and what we make of animals, and like in some cultures they're, the god of rabbits, that kind of thing. Just if that has informed your work at all, was a curiosity there. And again, thank you both. I hope those are worthwhile questions.
No, they're great. Thank you. Can you hear me, David? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Excellent. Good. We've got the tech working properly. Great. I'll come back on some of those questions, and then I'll pose one of my own for for everyone else to think about. So, in terms of Spallanzani's kind of use of the candle, the lantern, I don't have much to add to that in terms of the experiments, but what I can say is that through my study of naturalists, there's this real attachment to seeing, and the lack of ability to see offers a real stumbling block for a long time. Things change when we develop ways of seeing into the dark that are different. So infrared, for instance, where we are able to see into the dark, but animals can't see they're being seen. So actually these kind of visual technologies that come along are ways of providing these extended glimpses into the dark, so we can at least, or so that scientists can at least kind of fall back on that trusted method of scientific knowledge, which is observation. And that's a real kind of game changer. But what it doesn't do is that work of helping us understand what it is like to be that creature sensing in the world in a different way. So these are kind of different types of knowledge. I guess, that are kind of operating in parallel, that are doing different things. On the bees example, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. Is that it's not Clarence Hawkes? I'm not sure. I've come across one kind of blind naturalist.
I don't remember his name, but he is mentioned in the works of James Holman, The Blind Traveler, and I looked him up on Wikipedia, also in other places. Very preliminary, but I have an interest in scientists who are blind. For example, the woman that the professor, she studies stars and the way that because she needed the data to be put into sound, they
Mm,
actually learned about a whole new type of star, that kind of
mm.
thing, because she was able to track the pulses of the star, whatever it is. Anyway, I don't want to interrupt, but I can send it to you before by email or something for sure. I don't remember the name.
That'd be great. And I also have an interest in scientists who are blind. So so we should talk more about that, I think. Excellent. Okay. And then final thing, and then I'll ask my question, is that question around how we get at more than human sensory experience and then how we represent it. So, I mean, this is a good place to say that I've just won a grant a couple of months ago to build a network with some colleagues in the US, but also open to everyone, wherever they might be, to ask precisely that question. So I'm going to be in touch, in January probably to kind of talk about some kind of seminars we're going to do, an early career network for kind of emerging scholars in that sort of space as well. So yeah, that's just a little plug for that. This is a conversation that is going to continue, um, and hopefully answer those questions and advance us in some way. My question is kind of on that, which is for both of you, which is if we accept that we can't fully know what it is like to sense beyond our own sensing bodies, how close is close enough? How much are we satisfied with thinking we know in order to, you know, at least kind of affect the lives of individuals or other species who do live differently? I'll park that for the moment, and then we come back to it. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, thank you both. I'm just gonna write down your last question, Andy, before I forget it. Um, uh, More than human lives. Um, yeah, maybe I'll jump to David's first question, come back to Andy's, and I also have a different question
Hmm.
as well. So on the note of symbology or like the semiotics or culture of rabbits, yeah, absolutely. There are lots of ways that rabbits figure into human cultures and societies. So like there's the I think like moon rabbit or jade rabbit in some East Asian sort of cultures. There's some great work by Paul Nadasdy on the Kluane, like with the Kluane Nation in the Yukon, where he's an anthropologist, but he works with this nation, and talks about their hunting ontology when it comes to rabbits and sort of the gift in the animal. That's the paper I'm thinking of from 2007. Um, and so this sort of culture doesn't quite factor into the specific work I'm doing now, let's say. But I am informed by it within sort of this broader kind of contextual, how do rabbits figure into um, our society, kind of way. So very particularly, I worked for an animal sheltering organization for a very long time prior to starting the PhD, and my work is more focused on addressing sort of the problems that I've seen and experienced in my work at the SPCA or the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Um, and so I don't, talk a ton about culture. Um, but yeah, absolutely a very like important point. And rabbits have very long histories. They were domesticated by the Romans, centuries ago. And maybe turning to Andy's question about how much do we need to know, or how close is close enough, so we can, like, as we impact, these other lives. Um, I think like for me, in the context of rabbits, um, I think it's about knowing sort of their natural history and like what they do, what's a thing that like what are things that are normal for them to do. We know they like to dig, we know they burrow, we know they like eat grass and stuff. Maybe we shouldn't be keeping them in cages, or putting them in pens and giving them, small spaces. Maybe we should be housing them differently. So most recently, the Association of Shelter Veterinarians, which is an American organization, but they're quite influential worldwide, but they published their standards of care for rabbits in animal shelters, and they're recommending, I believe, larger sizes, so 3 to 4, or potentially 5 animals together, as opposed to the common 1 or 2. So I think this slowly sort of moves us into what is natural, which is also very contested, like as a term for rabbits. And I think we can think about similar things for other species of animals, um,
Mm.
and maybe less on the preservation or conservation if there are sort of links with hunting or like game, if that's sort of the reason that we're conserving. Um, and maybe we focus more on, yeah, sort of what do they like to do, and how can we ensure that they still do that?
Mm. Mhm.
And yeah, and I think my question for the both of you, coming actually from this scientific focus on observation, that Andy you had mentioned, um, I'm curious to know, well, how else, do we define what observation is or what it could be in this sort of more than visual sense, as you both have been um, discussing. So what does that mean for how we might do science with animals, or I guess
Mm.
plants or sort of other beings, rocks? Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Um, Perhaps I'll speak to that first and then hand over to David. Um, so I think history tells us certainly that scientists have, whilst the kind of the discipline has often been wedded to that kind of visual observation, deep visual observation as a way of knowing, there have been people within those spaces who have recognized and lent into these kind of other forms of knowing as well. So we find, for example, people who I think of themselves as naturalists of the night, who reject visual technologies and they choose to go out night after night in order to listen for the sounds of creatures, to learn to smell the different scents of animals, to know what is around, to master or kind of practice embodiment so that they can inhabit these spaces in order to experience them and learn through that experience. And that kind of subjective whole body experience has been important to some kind of groups of scientists at different points in history. So I think there's real precedent for learning to use our senses in kind of combination with each other as ways of creating different kinds of knowledge.
David, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just so lovely to be here, get to talk about all this stuff with the two of you. It's very lovely, especially at the very end of this experience of writing. I I'll try to answer both questions in one, I guess, in terms of just trying to be brief. But uh, in terms of the question, like how much is enough to satisfy, like kind of what you're saying, Andy, I think about if we accept we cannot fully know like how much is close enough, what is enough, and like our desire to know what it is like to sense and feel in another way. And then with what Melvin was saying about this way of defining observation, it's so funny with bats. The first time I read What Is It Like to Be a Bat, I could not help but think of Helen Keller for the way in which she experienced the world through such a different primacy, a different hierarchy of the senses, and vibration was so important to her. So sound is not just what the ears can hear, but also what you can feel through your body. Um, and I think, I mean, that's kind of my approach. I was realizing with your presentations, I wish I had found a way to fit in more about hawk sensoriums, the ways in which they, I think that for me is one answer is the way that, say, hawk vision so outstrips human vision. They have 4 color receptors, not just 3. They can see polarized light. They can sense the electromagnetic, the magnetic fields of the Earth. Their distance vision is so far beyond ours, so that in a way we are just visually impaired, if not blind, in comparison to them. The idea of the exceptionality of human ocular centrism is just ridiculous in comparison to a hawk. But also, I think that idea of cripping the observation or cripping science, or or looking to other cultures, right? Like rather than just Western science is really the important thing. But yeah, a lot of my work is about Keller and the ways in which that she had to justify her that she was, say, for example, literate, and then if she was, what she said had any was legitimate, that her experiences of the world were true, and that she could speak through them in not just visual or auditory metaphors, and the critiques against her for that, and even that she was just legible. And so I guess I often think, like, even though, like Eli Clare or Mel Chen or so many other good scholars of disability studies have said, we should be very careful about our equivalencies of disability and animality, especially because of the racism there, the ableism, etc. However, I think there's some important coalition politics in terms of if we do it differently and more thoughtfully. And through this work, H is for Hawk and Michalko's The Two and One, my work has been to try to think through, yeah, how can we be a bit more humble in terms of what we don't know? And maybe we will never know. And like McDonald says, hawks aren't just there for us. They are entirely their own thing outside of us. And yes, we do make stories about them, but I kind of like that idea of feeling small in the face of a sensorium that is so different from ours. And then how it reminds us, I think, kind of what you were saying, Andy, too, about uh, maybe that we appreciate our other senses or what we can learn from them differently. Yeah, that's just some rough thoughts. I hope that is answering the questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. The first is from Hannah, who writes, "Thank you very much for all the presentations. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I'm unable to speak at the moment, so I'm asking via chat. I have a question for Melvin. The concept of rabbit plasticity seems very interesting. Species are a convenient classification, and there seem to be many examples that cross species boundaries, like raccoons or foxes. I'd love to hear more about what is specific and unique to the European rabbit in terms of plasticity. Also, I'm curious about how the concept of rabbit plasticity might offer a new perspective beyond the usual feral domestication classification."
Yeah, thanks for this question, Hannah. Yeah, and I think plasticity is I agree, like it's a very like useful and sort of interesting concept that's been sort of changed from I guess that's uh the maybe more original sort of creation. Um and yeah, like I think for the European rabbit, because of its long history of domestication and how it's been used. So oftentimes, like when we talk about European rabbits and like these are also domesticated or feral ones in like Australia with these rabbit wars, and there's been tons of things that have been tested to try to eliminate these rabbits. They were originally introduced for hunting. And because it was sort of fun for people to shoot at them and had send their dogs after them. Um, so this sort of like molding or sort of or like putting rabbits where it's convenient to put them. So, when they are fluffy and cute and we want to be around them, then we call them a pet. But even this really cute rabbit, once it's dumped, we don't want them, at the beach or in the forest, then we call them feral, or in the case of British Columbia, wildlife. I think in that sort of sense, they're quite plastic. And a bit different, I guess, from other species. I guess I mean, you mentioned raccoons. Like, I don't think humans have used raccoons necessarily in similar ways. Foxes we've often hunt them for meat. So we also farm them for fur. We also do experiments on foxes. Um, but as I was talking to someone about plasticity last week, actually, and they had mentioned that dogs might also see something similar. So I think in the context of maybe mainstream Canadian society, rabbits are sort of unique in this way that we experiment on them, that we do lots, like, we have them as pets, we eat them. But dogs in Tehran are also feral. Dogs elsewhere are eaten. So I think I might generalize as I sort of develop this sort of idea. I might generalize it a little bit more beyond the rabbit. Um, but as far as a perspective beyond taxonomy of feral, domesticated, or wild, I think it focuses more on what we're doing to the animal and the impact that and I may put an asterisk with that because it depends on which human, I guess we're talking about. Um, how we're engaging with these rabbits and highlighting that as opposed to the outcome of now they're domesticated, how do we treat them? And maybe instead of jumping there, we could focus a bit on, well, why are we classifying them in this way? What ends are we trying to accomplish with them? Sort of moving the conversation up a metaphysical level.
Mhm.
Hopefully that helps. Or yeah, some initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Melvin. We have another question, and because my own question is actually quite strongly related to this one, I'm going to piggyback. I'm going to cheat and piggyback and ask them both together. So the question is, how do we square the kinds of violences required to gain sensory knowledge from other animals with the productive uses of this knowledge for humans and non-humans alike? Is there any way to justify this violence aside from the needs of rational, objective inquiry? And my piggyback question is that Andy, the violent extraction of sensory data, the knowledge of sensoria from animals was right at the center of your presentation. But there was also violence lurking in both David's and Melvin's. And I'm wondering if I could ask all of you to speak perhaps about the way that violence is actually part of the sort of existential violence is sort of part of the relational set that actually shapes our understanding of human and non-human, human and animal relations in all of those cases. David, I know that you also have other things to say about violence and applied sensorium, so please feel free.
Do you want to go? Do either of you want to go first?
No, feel free, David, if you want to go.
Okay, I did it to myself. It's a great question, Kate. And yeah, I mean, in one way, I think this chapter on human and more than human kinships, really made me, really helped me to see that one of the things that I was most annoyed with, say, something like disability studies, but particularly what we might call blindness studies, was all this. Stress about using blindness as a metaphor in language, but very little attention put to the ways in which we are blinding one another, just humans alone, through violence. So the way that it's done through police brutality related to environmental injustice, intimate partner violence, ocular trauma is something that really appears almost once you realize what it is, it's almost too late to treat if the ophthalmologist or the doctor doesn't understand that you've had head trauma. The way that the World Health Organization almost hides the way that violence is such a main producer of blindness by using terms like glaucoma and other things that just terrifying. And in terms of animals, yeah, the relationship between McDonald and her being haunted by T.H. White, his he kind of admits to all the things he did to Goss, and it's horrible. And she also, causes some harm to Mabel, not at all to the point, and I don't want to be an apologist, to the point that White does to Goss, and we don't even actually know at the end of the day. It's pretty easy to suspect that what happened to Goss was his death because the torn jesses, he's tangled in a tree. The poor thing probably died of starvation at some point, and it died in a terrible way because of White's sort of all kinds of things happening in his life. So yeah, I think. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what each of you think. I mean, again, I think this goes back to, say, Melvin, the sense of I was so struck by, Wildlife Act says they are this, like the violence even of the naming. So like while blindness as metaphor, I think, can be violent, but isn't as violent as the actual way of, say, gouging out an eye or putting someone's eye out purposefully. But the way of using taxonomies and categorizations, which violently change an animal into something, what is the name for rabbit meat? I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but say we say a cow and then beef and a chicken and poultry, that distinction. Um, and so with hawks, I think, but sorry, to bring it back just to hawks and speak for myself, I really do appreciate the way that MacDonald lays out these older ways of thinking about hawks that are around their paranoia and their fretfulness and also how they sort of have this viciousness. But MacDonald takes pains to clearly say they are um, birds of prey. They are hunters. They eat creatures. They dive bomb from above without warning and tear them to pieces and eat them. But they are not atrocities. They're not a justification for atrocities. They're never a justification for violence, like say their associations of hawk emblems for the Nazis, say, or fascism. And I think there's something important there around that using how we observe animals, to go back to the observation question, and the way they relate to the world or are in the world to justify our own violence is a really terrible sort of violence. And we have to be careful about the ways that but at the same time, we have to be careful about the ways we apply our um, sense of, like hawks can't be vegetarians, for example, not successfully, I don't think. But still, anyway, to have a more nuanced and a balanced sense of how that works. But I think Melvin and Addy probably have more interesting things to say about violence in that way.
Mm. That was great. Shall I come in next? I've got a few thoughts on this, and I'm sorry if they're not cohesive, but I think on the one hand, you do have the violence of taking animals out of their environments and then taking them to bits is a way of knowing. There's also a way of knowing that is about people who are going into these dark places. They go into the night, go into the deep sea, go underground, wherever it might be. That is violent in a different way because the sheer presence of an individual or a form of technology that allows an individual to go there is shaping the way that nature works in that time and place. These are I think, quite acute, like fast forms of violence. They're kind of changing and manipulating in the moment. But also we could think about this, or certainly I'm thinking about this in terms of the slow violence of us again, us being a particular type of us, but kind of changing the world for our sensory needs, lighting the environment, building our infrastructures. These are slower forms of violence that are also changing the way species behave, killing species certainly too. I do think that there's a science that's aware of that. So I would say kind of like science today, activated by technology, forms of remote sensing, kind of going and looking at places, sensing the realities of those places without having to go there, is a much less kind of violent form of knowing that has come about, I think, in not only because people really want to go into these dark places, but also because of that knowledge of the slow violence that human presence can cause and is causing kind of on that planetary scale. So yeah, I think that's how I'm kind of thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks, both of you for your thoughts on these questions. Um, and I think I have a sort of hybrid kind of answer. And like I relate it to the different kinds of violence that we do. And I think I guess some are, more acceptable now than others. If we don't really want to be experimenting on animals anymore, or butchering them or slaughtering them. But I'm reminded of I'm just trying to find the actual quote, but it's Radhika Govindrajan's book, Animal Intimacies. It's from 2018. But she writes somewhere in that book, and this is her ethnography of animal-human relationships in a village in the central Himalayas. I found it. So she argues, this towards the very end of her book, that violence does not always preclude care, attention, or even love. And she shows that sort of with her book. I think, maybe we can dispute if you are slaughtering an animal, maybe not necessarily loving or caring, or maybe you could be, I guess, depending on what you're doing. Um, but that I think like violence is inherent to things that we do. And so it's sort of like hard to not do that. As Andy said, like, going into an animal's environment, like me going to these rabbit colonies or going into their spaces, can be quite violent for them. They don't really know who I am. I'm unfamiliar in many different ways for them. And now I'm just randomly in their space trying to touch them or feed them. Um, but I think that, I guess, like, the beyond the violence sort of figuring into the labels, um, it can be accompanied by this desire to make things better, for these animals. For the case of rabbits, like, we don't usually kill a bunch of them now. We usually will, like, if they've been infected with rabbit hemorrhagic disease, which is now actually coming a lot onto this continent from Europe and other places, uh, laboratories will test them and that kind of stuff. So, it's not, I guess, as violent. But if you are working with birds, for example, there's a big bird flu issue going around. Um, and there are just a bunch of ostriches that were culled, like in BC, because of avian flu, and even with poultry and stuff, there's a big concern about it. You have to kill a lot of these birds. You also have to kill fish, and it is sort of violent to do that. But you test them all. You test the carcasses. You work with them, work with these bodies in order to protect the population as a whole. So it's hard to, I guess, wrestle with it. What like, how to justify it. um yeah, I guess, like, on those, like, levels. um but I think it's necessary. Some degree is necessary. um and to Kate's question, like, about how it's sort of part of the biopolitical constellation, um there are some other examples with the required culling, or testing. um yeah.
Great.
We have a question from Taryn.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. So Melvin, I think that reflection really connected well to a question I had for all of you. So a thread I heard across all of your presentations was the violence of the control or mastery over animals. And Melvin, your reflections in your talk, as well as what you just gave, especially your reflections on animal control work, made me think about how sometimes conservation or animal control work, along with scientific research, like what you described, Andy, can have these like echoes of saviorism or patriarchy, doing what's best for the animal or stepping in to save them, and how that can in turn justify violence, like experimentation on bats or the euthanasia and culling of rabbits or the ostriches you just described, Melvin. So I don't have the answer to this, and it's more kind of philosophical, but a question I have for all of you is like, what do you think the line is between human animal kinship and then dominance and control?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. Um, uh, I wonder whether that comes back to the question at the beginning, which is around how close is close enough. So we can try and really, like, there's a real kind of perhaps egotistical urge to understand the reality of an animal's sensory world. But maybe the question is, I suppose, the other kind of David and Melvin have also kind of touched on this. What is that knowledge allowing us to do? Is that not, how vital is that knowledge? Is it knowledge for knowledge's sake? That's what I'm saying. Do we just want to know it and the violence is there just because we want to know it? Or is this more on, actually, this is going to help us to better shape the world as a shared place if we have that knowledge. So it seems to me it's about the line is somewhere kind of around the egotism of knowing and the usefulness of knowing for the purpose of sharing places. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers.
Yeah, I can jump in. And thanks, Taryn, for this for your question. Very provocative, and I have to say I agree with Andy. Um, like what is the violence, I guess, for? And what is this knowledge allowing us to do? Because even in like pet or companion relationships, there is dominance and control, despite there being a kinship. Um, like, I'm staying with my partners and like they have a cat. Um, love this cat. This cat, she's totally starting to like me. But she is, as many cats are, kept indoors. So she has a specific place that she can go to the toilet, right? She has a specific place to get her food and water. Um, I know other people who have cats who have them indoor, outdoor. Obviously, even other people have them fully outdoor or barn cats, whatever. Um, so that always is part of, I think, our relationships. Um, and so that line maybe changes or is quite flexible. I'm trying to think of maybe a different um, metaphor or analogy. Like maybe it's like a permeable membrane, and not a hard line, like a solid line, or like a stone wall or something, like maybe there is this sort of push and pull within it. Um, that sometimes it shows up, but sometimes it doesn't. And maybe that's part of the kind of relationship we have, with each animal we encounter.
Great.
Can I give a cool? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt Melvin, that's all. Yeah. If I can add to that, I was listening and taking some notes. Thank you for your question. One of the ways I think about it, and I feel like I learned this from Haraway, but most poignantly from Julieta Singh from their book Unthinking Mastery. Like in one way, kind of like you were saying, Melvin, maybe the idea of the line of the boundary, part of what we need to do is actually consider the ways that we are in kinship already. We are in relationship already. So even if we are not the ones pulling the trigger or dropping the poison or, culling the herd because of disease, we are in relation to that happening in the world. There's questions, of course, proximity. There are questions about who is benefiting more than others. It's not at all an equal distribution of responsibility any more than it's an equal distribution of, say, who experiences more or less violence in the world. Like when I think of the distribution of blindness through violence, it's definitely not like in the, quote unquote, developed and privileged, North American Western world. We have done away with many kinds of violence that used to come up in childhood, etc., that are still happen in other places in the world, in the global South, etc. Um, but so again, that uneven distribution, right? But I do think there's something important, kind of, not quite what you were saying, Melvin, but I think sort of in coalition with like that there's a way that we're in relationship whether we do the violence or not, where the different worlds affect us, maybe especially when we don't see them or notice them. And that makes me think of something I've thought about a lot in terms of like the question, like what does knowing give you that being with cannot? So I really liked, for example, Melvin, that sense of the question, how do we experience the rabbits? How do they experience us? So rather than trying to know what is it like to be with, so that epistemology doesn't become the most valorized or the most important question there. And kind of like some of the different natural philosophers that you were talking about, Andy, who had these more less domineering approaches to gaining knowledge, or McDonald saying, being with a living, breathing hawk is such a privilege and so like it's hard to understand what a hawk is and how different from a human with just looking at them on a screen. I would also say, again, the question of mastery, like sing, and I think that's why I was thinking about the with us all the time and the being with versus knowing, like the question of mastery and unmastery. What are we trying to master? And Andy, you mentioned egotism. So and the quote I took from Julieta saying, like, can we listen to those voices and those songs of more than human worlds, other people that we have been untrained to hear? And can we listen vulnerably? So that means that what we hear may put us into proximity to our own danger, not just theirs, or may put in danger the ideals or ideologies we hold dear but actually need to let go of. And that idea of upturning who teaches and rescues. So the last thing I'll just say is one thing that the other book, The Two in One with Macalco, there's this moment where it's at the end of the book. He's moved from Toronto to the East Coast, and their friends have driven them there. And so he's got, his guide dog, another dog, two cats, his partner. And there's this moment where Smokey, his Labrador dog guide, turns to him kind of like, oh, are we all getting in the van? And Rod doesn't even have to say anything. And Smokey's kind of like, oh, they've dropped us off. They are leaving. We're staying. And Smokey just leans into Rod in this, Macalco, this like just really deep unspoken, nonverbal understanding and pressure of being with and understanding something about like, oh, we did that journey together. We were never going back. And maybe Smokey didn't understand that before, but definitely there's a feeling of understanding that then. And Macalco even says, like, I don't think Smokey understands blindness like we do, but I do think he understands that I am blind. There's just things you kind of know from being with. Well, that's not too rambly, but that's what I partly how I would answer that question.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Shay, I'm very sorry. We are already over time. Melvin, there is another question from you in the chat. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to end it there. I'm extremely aware that, thank you, Shay. I'm extremely aware of how late it is in the UK. So I think people would like to go and have their evening meal now. So thank you very much to David and to Andy and to Melvin for absolutely wonderful presentations and conversation. And thank you all for being here. I just want to let you know that the next installment in our More Than Humanities series is a panel on February the 4th on more than human curation. And that panel will include Alice Wold, who is a lecturer in Imperial and Environmental History at the University of Bristol, Lisa Myers, who is the York Research Chair in Indigenous Art and Curatorial Practice in EUC, and Isla Gladstone, who is the Senior Curator for the Natural Science Collection at Bristol Culture at the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery. So please join us on February 4th, and thank you again. And it was just wonderful. I'm so grateful.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.
Nice to meet you, Melvin.
Nice to meet you.
Great work.